Let's come to today's presentation. We're looking at an ongoing continuity that has a sinuous energy form. It's an energy frequency, and so it will have a signature that's well known and understandable, and that this signature is in fact something which we're all familiar with, and that is that there is a sine wave when energy is in its wave form, and there is a line when energy becomes particled. This is the pairing of the ways in which light as an energy occurs. It occurs as a wave, it occurs as photons, as particles. And the photons carry the facility of the wave. And that facility is electromagnetic energy. It has an electric line that loves to intergal in particality. It loves to come together. It loves intergaling. The wave is a different quality. It's differential. It has a differential quality to its energy. And so magnetism is different from the way in which an electric current, moving by its polarity, moving by the way in which positive and negative make a duality. A wave form is different, does not work integrally, spirals itself around the line of motion of the electric current in the electromagnetic wave, and that this is an indication for us of the way in which a universe of phenomena is the fruit, the outcome of a soil of the way in which a dynamic of differential energy occurs in its flow, in its ongoing, but that flow occurs within a field. So when it came to the later half of the 20th century, the quantum quandary, the uncertainty of being able to have an observer measure the space location of a particle, and that energy spread. All of this was brought into a field of resolution by quantum field theory, QFT. We, in the beginning of the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, are positioned, are poised, are ready to behold a revelation that movement, that dynamic within a zero field is time itself. And that time itself in its dynamic energy wave is able to carry with it the particality of the universe in terms of the space, in terms of the dimensions of space, that the dimension of time is that stem carrying the sap of the tree that becomes the universe within a ground of a fertile zero field. So that when one has a graphing of an energy frequency of a wave, whatever kind of wave will have its crests and troughs, and it will have a symmetry around a horizon that is median to those symmetries of crests and troughs, and carries the dynamic. And so time has that as well. It has crests and troughs, and it has a median horizon, which is, in actuality, the zero field itself, that now has no emphasis whether it's going to be crusting or troughing. And so the dynamic of time occurs quite naturally within the zero field and carries as itself that zero field, that zero horizon, so that time becomes mysterious much later on when there are thinking beings. And when they get to where we got to early in the 20th century, in the wonderful visioning field of Einstein, that space-time has its continuity, where it is a fabric that allows for an impress of particality to curve space-time, so that what would be a field of nature now becomes a woven tapestry that is able to have its curves, its indentations, its curving, and that this then should be gravity. So that a field for the universe should be gravity, gravitation. And it should center itself on particality. This became apparent about 400 years ago to an Einstein of the time. His name was Johannes Kepler. He was given an assignment to turn into mathematics, into a mathematical expression, the observations of orbits of planets like Mars around the sun, and to plot out the way in which it could be expressed in mathematics. And discovered that the accuracy of all of the observations done by a rather pugnacious man named Tycho Brahe, as we've talked about, he was given an island off the coast of Denmark, and he called it Urania, and there had his observatory, and not so much a huge telescope, but he had a telescope built so that he could lie in its arc, and his observations were able to be cradled in such a way that he made very accurate and specific locations of where the planets were in their orbits around the sun from different times. And Kepler was a good enough visionary in mathematics to understand that if this indeed was the orbit, it was not a circle, but it was an ellipse, which is astounding in a very basic way. It took almost 100 years for someone to appreciate the mystery of the ellipse. It means that gravity is not centered in phenomenon. It's not centered in the star. It's not centered in the planets. It's centered in a ratioed way between the star and its planets, so that the center of gravitation is not in a body, not in a phenomenon, not in something, but is in pure space. The center of our star system is off the surface of the sun by some number of tens of thousands of miles. It's called a Bary center, B-A-R-Y, which meant 400 years ago that there is a new cosmology. And Kepler published a book in 1604 called The New Astronomy. That this is a remarkable event to be able not only to understand, but to work out the math. So this is how it is expressible in terms of the highest math that is possible. It was an indication that there was a possibility for a written language of mathematics to be able to be precise enough to teach us that it isn't just what we can see. It isn't just what we can then integral and measure, but it is the relationalities where the meaning lies and not in the things. This escaped almost everyone for almost a century. I'm the first person to be able to understand math visionarily enough to see what the situation really was turning out to be was Isaac Newton. And he saw that there are a pair of problems, a pair of fields where the resolution can take place. One of them certainly is the refinement of mathematics to bring it to a sophistication so that one could really talk in a written mathematical expressive language way what was going on. But that the precursor of that, or the companion to that, the forerunner of that, was to be able to see accurately. And all of young Newton's early works were about optics. And he would send these letters on what he was working on to Henry Oldenburg, who was the president of the Royal Society in London, founded by Thomas Sprat some 100 years before. But Newton could never publish his book on it because it was not completable. He was able to publish his book on the mathematics of it as the Principia Mathematica in 1687, some almost 15 years after he started working on optics. And he published his optics on the centenary of Kepler's The New Astronomy as the optics by Sir Isaac Newton by that time. That there is a particular cone of light that the eye is sensitive to, and that one can work with the geometry of this in terms of taking that cone of light and making sections through it. They're called conic sections in math. And the original conic sections go back to Greek mathematicians in Alexandria some 1,500 years before Newton began working with these things. But key to this was the fact that one could prismatically have a diffraction of light into its constituent colors. Its calibration of waveforms of light, introducing into a dark room with just a slit of daylight coming through, sunlight, into a glass prism, and there on the wall would be the rainbow, the color spectrum. And it goes on from there quite far. But that paired with Newton's discovery, the proverbial thing is that an apple falls from the tree and hits him on the head. Gravity brings it down, brings it to the center of where things are, the center of the earth, etc., the center of the sun. All of this becomes a quality of mystery even after it is expressed in mathematics. And it took several generations for there to be someone who finally did understand it and was able to translate it. It was translated first out of the Latin into the French, and we've gone through that. What has happened in our time by 2014 is a miseducation on a grand scale that begs all of the issues, not only back to Kepler and Newton and Madame de Châtelet with Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin, and a whole development of the way in which one can investigate the cosmic qualities of meaning in interrelationalities of the universe. That the universe is something to look at and to see, but it is the unseen that develops the meaning. I call it ratios of the real. So that there is a quality of real humility in committing one's inquiry to the continuity of patience, the appreciation of an analytic that develops the proportionality of relationalities in terms of the spectrum, in terms of a rainbow, which by 2014, on your computer, you can have millions of colors. You can have a rainbow that no one could possibly see, and yet you know that it is real. But you do not know why or how it is real. And so there is a regression from actuality, which can be expressed by 2014, very, very well. Not only mathematically, but in a refined use of language, like that refinement of mathematics. The refinement of language is a poetic. Truth is beauty, and beauty is truth. But for man, very often, never the twain shall meet. That regression is due to being stopped in the mind. And the key to it being stopped in the mind is because one trusts the picture. One trusts the phenomenal picture. One trusts the optics of what one can see of phenomena, of particality, of the graphability of waves and energy and so forth. And all of this becomes increasingly complex to the point of confusion unless it is indexed in such a way to filter it to be manageable, which has happened. But the most unmanageable dimension of all of that is time. And it is the unmanageability of the dimension of time that is the energy of how the cosmos, in its meaningful relationalities, parents and nurtures and sustains the phenomenal universe. We're all familiar with the percentage. The phenomenal universe that we can see, that the optics will identify, is about 4% of what can be mathematically determined as the whole scope of the real. That space itself has intermediate, almost phenomenal qualities, is such that we can now, with experiments and with instruments, understand that very close to heavy gravitational forms, where light is bent, not just by a star or by a galaxy, but by whole clusters of galaxies working together as an ensemble, that there is such a thing as an assembly of galaxies that can, as an ensemble, bend the light of galaxies far beyond them. And when it bends, it doesn't bend so that you see the galaxy skewed over one place. You see a four-part, a quaternary. And one can use this lensing, galactic cluster lensing, to see even deeper into space-time. This quality in a picture is called framing, to make the picture. This is how we give the optics, the visuality, a descriptive traction. And one of the problems that came up in the latter part of the 20th century is that just as there was the discovery that there is around powerful stars, space-time itself as a framing, as the fabric of space-time, suffers frame dragging. There's a hiatus of its registry in time. So that by the mid-1970s, all of this was being applied as one would expect and hope and encourage it to be applied, not only in terms of the universe, but in terms of ourselves. One of the deep developments was the profound understanding that language helps make the picture. In fact, the picture of its images, when given particality, they're called pixels. And if you have enough pixels per space frame, one begins to get the picture. Comes into what we would call focus, phenomenal focus. We can see what we're looking at. But language works with a recursive quality of relationality and cooperation and uncooperation with the neural system of human beings, with the neural system of beings, of life beings. That when you pair those, you get a neuro-linguistic programming of what not only can be expected, but of what can be seen, of what can be expressed, of what can be felt, because images have a concomitant feeling tone for us, and for animal life, and even for plant life. Plants have feeling, not condensed and intensified like ours or animals. Dogs will wag their tails. Horses will come up for apples and so forth. But anyone who has learned a high Dharma yoga in the mountains, in the forests, understands that you can meditate with not only with trees, but with the whole forest. That's how I grew up. But the feeling tones of images in a neuro-linguistic framing can be suspect because one can be stuck in a frame. And so one of the very powerful books that came out at that time, out of the mid-1970s into the early 1980s, Reframing. Its subtitle, Neuro-linguistic programming and the transformation of meaning. And the authors are not only were made quite famous, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, but the editors of Reframing, Steve Andreas and his wife, Kanarai Andreas. It is the presentation of reframing that is extremely important and highly seductive. It begins with an introduction by Kanarai. A very old Chinese Taoist story describes a farmer in a poor country village considered well-to-do because he had a horse for plowing. And people said, "You're very lucky." He said, "Maybe." One day the horse ran away, and they said, "Well, you're finished. You're going to be like the rest of us." And he said, "Maybe." And the horse came back in companion with 2 wild horses. They said, "Well, you're now 3 times, thrice as rich." And he said, "Maybe." And his son tried to ride one of the horses, and the horse was wild and bucked him, and he broke a leg. And they said, "Well, how unfortunate this is." And he said, "Maybe." And the next week, the emperor sent his troops out to get recruits, and they said, "This young man can't come, he can't serve, he has a broken leg, and who knows if he's going to be able to walk right." "Well, you're very fortunate, aren't you?" "Well, maybe." The meaning that any event has depends upon the frame in which we perceive it. So that perception and framing conception are integrally linked together. They're not only a barbell, but in some circles it's called a dumbbell. And you can exercise and you can build your muscles by manipulating dumbbells. Not just your muscles, but your social muscles, your corporate muscles, your military muscles. You can get superhero, transhuman sized. There's a recent book from 2008. It's called Post-Human Metamorphoses, Narrative and Systems. Narrative has to do with the mythic horizon of language. The flow of how images and feeling tones and spoken language work together and become the source of grasping so that one can hear it and understand it and feel it and see it. And out of this then comes what you can take from it, and you can have a conception, which, if you're really careful about it, you can make sure that your conception proofs out your perception. And so the frame is useful in that way, but it can become out of date, can become stuck, can become really seen to be a very small sampling. When we change the frame, we change the meaning. This is called reframing. Changing the frame in which a person perceives events in order to change the meaning. When the meaning changes, the person's responses and behaviors also change. Your responses ritually and your behavior ritually. not just actions, but responses. Not just your comportment, but your behavior. Hence the programming. If you can codify your ritual in terms of a structured meaning that has many different frames consulted so that you have a largesse of reframingness, one will then have a neuro-linguistic programming that is able to carry the